Friends, our next panel, which is focused on generative AI advancements, challenges, and future prospects, is being moderated by my dear friend Ashish Bansal, who will be introducing the panelists. But before that, let me introduce the moderator himself, a friend of mine for almost 30 years. He was the co-founder of Global IIT Artificial Intelligence and Machine Learning Forum with me 7 to 8 years back. A walking encyclopedia in artificial intelligence. He has probably worked across so many industries, verticals, and use cases that we do not even have time to talk about them. Capital One, where he talked and looked into subprime lending to fraud detection. Twitter, where he basically worked on recommendation systems. Amazon Twitch, where his recommendation work was certainly greatly appreciated. And now he is at Google Cloud. You name the institution, you talk about companies and technologies, and as everybody knows in Silicon Valley, he not only has an ability to explain something, but in such a way that even a layman can understand it. He's an undergraduate from one of the IITs, IIT BHU, and an MBA from Kellogg School of Management. But the most important thing, I'm really thankful to him for tolerating me as a friend for 30 years. Not many people do that mistake. And I can't end this without bringing our third pillar of AI/ML Forum. Thanks, Surabhi, for tolerating both of us for so many years. Thank you.
Thank you, Tushar, for that introduction. I'm not sure I had much choice in not being your friend because we shared a hostel at one point in our lives. Before we begin, I have a small request. There's a ton of empty seats and there's a ton of people who are standing in the back. So can I just request folks to just scoot around, make some seats available and visible so that the folks can actually sit? Because we have a nice panel and we want to make sure everybody is able to listen and hear the conversation. With that, I want to introduce the panelists, and you might have noticed a pattern in the names here. To be on this panel, your name needs to start with an A, and consequently, we've decided to rename Igor to Igor. And he told me that some of his family uses a different A word for him. But I know Igor for a while. Igor is one of the most fantastic people that I know of. He is the CEO and founder of Prion. His prior work was acquired by Amazon and became the foundation for Alexa. He's worked in machine learning before it was cool, and he actually made stuff work in and I would like to say that he's probably continuing this trend because he has worked on generative AI for a few years in his firm before generative AI was coined and became cool as a term. So Igor, our pleasure to have you here. We have Ashish Kakran right next to Igor. He's a venture capitalist at Tom West Ventures. He worked at Engineering Capital with Ashmeet Sidana, not a name that's familiar to a lot of you. He's worked on several early-stage cloud data ML cybersecurity startups like Harness, Isovalent, Secognito, and Opaque Systems. Ashish, a pleasure. And Ashish and I'm Ashish 1, he's Ashish 2, A1, A2, just in case you want to disambiguate this. And we set up this panel so that it confuses generative AI, like they can't figure out which Ashish we're talking about, right? And then Ankit, last but not the least, he's a tech manager at Meta. He's working on their generative AI team. He's a very bright and upcoming data scientist, won a bunch of 40 under 40 awards at a variety of international forums. He's presented at numerous conferences, done a ton of work, written books. So it's my pleasure and my honor to have all of you here with us on this panel. And we have about 30 minutes. So it's going to be a little bit of a rapid fire for us to go through some of the questions that people have. So let me actually start with a question, and maybe Ankit, Ashish, and Igor. It's a softball, just to get you warmed up, right? What's the thing that has excited you most about the recent advances in generative AI? Like, what's the one thing that you're like, oh, wow, I couldn't do this before?
Yeah, hi, thanks. Thanks, Ashish, first of all, for having a good introduction and also inviting us to the panel. I think for me, the major thing that has excited me about generative AI is when now we can have something called as AI native applications versus AI as an enabler to optimize something. I think most of the times we have seen AI in the last few years has been AI to optimize maybe better engagement on social media or better search results on Google, something like that. But today, I think with generative AI, what we are seeing is like more of AI native style applications directly, where AI is the product and not an enabler to the final product. So I think that has got me really excited about this space.
Yeah, I think as Debanjan mentioned earlier, this is the iPhone moment. Like every 10 to 15 years, what happens is, humans change the way they interact with technology, with machines, whether it's browsers, then iPhone, and I think this is the next big thing. It's accelerating really rapidly. Like that paper on transformers was published in 2017, and now we are seeing technology that people expected to be here in 10 to 15 years. So everyone is kind of scrambling to make sense of it. How do I use it in the enterprise, B2C use cases? And, in the past, if you look at the adoption among users, Airbnb, and I have some numbers, it took them about 900 days to hit 1 million users. Facebook took about 300. And then how long does it take ChatGPT? Like 5 days. No amount of like PR spend or innovative ad campaigns can get you there. The product has to be really intuitive. There has to be real value. So now we are seeing this rapid transformation, and it's just the beginning. I think this is the beginning of a next super cycle that will continue for 10 to 15 years. And from foundation models to now agents, there's just so much happening, which I find to be really fascinating.
Ashish, your great friend called you a walking encyclopedia. Are you Britannica or Wikipedia?
I think the mic's not working, but I think with ChatGPT, all the encyclopedias will be replaced. So we would probably need more intelligence than knowledge. It's a constant theme that I talk about, which is there is a difference between being knowledgeable and being intelligent. And I think when we see all this hype about generative AI, we seem to blur the difference. If I memorize the entire law, code, whatever I need to do to pass my bar exam, does that make me intelligent or does that make me knowledgeable? And I would posit that it makes me knowledgeable but not necessarily intelligent. No disrespect to the lawyers in the room.
Okay. Generative AI is the Donald Trump of AI. Okay? And with our esteemed keynote, it actually made us respect and honor the stuff that's actually in production. It's sort of like, oh wow, George Bush wasn't that bad by comparison. Our software is installed in nuclear power plants. By show of hands, how many of you want me to hallucinate answers to these operators and technicians in that plant? Anybody? Okay, mic drop.
Fantastic, thank you. So as we know that Igor will be playing this role of keeping us in check before our aspirations get far ahead of reality. Thank you for that. So we're going to do a quick poll with folks. I'm going to ask you a series of questions, and I'd like you to raise your hand and keep your hand raised if the answer is yes to the successive question, okay? So we're going to do 3 questions, okay? Simple. So how many of you have used ChatGPT? Okay, fantastic. Now keep your hands up. Don't put them down yet. Keep your hands up. And how many of you have used ChatGPT for more than 30 days? So if you've used it for less than 30 days, you can put your hands down. Okay. And in the folks that have used ChatGPT for more than 30 days, how many people's usage has remained same or increased? Okay. So you can probably take a quick look around the room, and that's just a reality check for everything that you're seeing on the internet, where you see a lot of influencers trying to push you to it. And in software or in social media, this is called the novelty effect, right? So we have to be very careful when we are running experiments and things like that, that when you introduce a new product, and by no means am I saying that it's a bad product, and I'm not trying to say that generative AI is not a good thing or good technology. All I'm trying to say is that we are seeing V1 of this technology. There is lots more to come. And it will come. And hopefully the folks on this panel in a few years, you're going to probably remember these folks on the panel as they create their companies and drive value in this space. I actually wanted to go back to you, Igor, and talk about some of the enterprise use cases, because your company, Prion, and I've been fortunate to see some of your demos when I was at Twitter, and like you could ingest business reports and like have a Slack bot that could answer arbitrary questions and stuff. So maybe your perspective on enterprise use cases that you see in the enterprises today, and if you are free to talk about some of your clients, maybe some of what you are actually seeing on the ground.
Yeah, so use cases are all over the place. I mean, things in paper plants, safety-related information that's getting emitted to technicians, competitive intelligence stuff in defense contractors, export control information. In those power plants that I mentioned, things like maintenance materials when those plants get refueled twice a year in order to shorten the time that these things are down, because it costs $3 million a day when they're not producing electricity. So they ran the gamut, but what we tended to focus on and drift towards is the core IP of these organizations. Think of a semiconductor company that has decades of past experiments that are not easy for them to illuminate and bring to the fore, and yet one of the strange things about AI is everybody looks at their calendar and sees the year 2023. A lot of this mathematics was discovered 100 years ago, and yet only because it ends up getting rediscovered because something else that's a supporting piece of foundation, whether it's AI accelerators, networks, and things like that, only now make it prevalent. Similar to the last speaker, I started my career at IBM, microelectronics, and then eventually joined the software group. I had a red book on neural networks as a 19-year-old in my little office as an intern. So this stuff was being discussed a long time ago, but guess what? The supporting structures didn't exist there.
Thank you, Igor. I actually want to move to Ashish Kakran, A2, my dear friend, and I want you to comment on maybe a couple of things, both because as a venture capitalist, you're probably talking to a lot of founders and people who are thinking about creating companies in this space. I would love for you to comment on both enterprise and customer or B2C use cases that you are seeing from your vantage point, and what is the key value that you think, or what is the key problems that you see people attempting to solve? Maybe because this is the entrepreneurship group, so maybe people get some ideas as well.
Yeah, no, I think great question. So there's a lot of experimentation going on, and to earlier comment that you made, yes, it's early, it's first innings, but I think the potential, everybody agrees this is big. If I look at enterprises, there are, at a high level, 3 different categories where adoption is already there. So the first use case would be, how do you make your employees more productive? So that could be some sort of a co-pilot. It could be for writing your code. It could be your security assessment. So there is a lot of innovation happening in that space. Actually, several of my friends who are expert coders, now they write 60-70% of the code automatically using something like GitHub Copilot or something other, like that. The second category, I would say, is the use of generative AI to make your existing SaaS investments more valuable. So you have purchased tools that are in cybersecurity or IT infrastructure space, and adoption may be low in the enterprise. People don't know how to get most value out of it. And now suddenly you add a layer of intelligence on top of it, and you can ask questions in simple like English language instead of writing a query. So there's a lot of innovation happening in that space. And the final one I would say is verticals where there's a lot of proprietary data, where you have to, you care about privacy of it, you care about, like if it gets leaked, for example, Bloomberg data, right? If it gets leaked, you basically lose your competitive advantage. So then enterprises there are doing things like Bloomberg GPT, where they're creating their own models, they're not using OpenAI or others, they want to preserve that. But then they can do very interesting things with it and start selling across in the same vertical. And same thing is happening in healthcare as well. So those are, at a high level, the things that I'm seeing.
Thank you. I think for a long time, technology has threatened many people's jobs. At least that's sort of the sentiment in the public. Now we have a technology that threatens engineers' jobs. So in some ways, we got to eat our own dog food and see how the co-pilots of the world fare about and go on in the future. And going back to my earlier point about knowledge versus intelligence, there is a class of people who are called knowledge workers, right? We've all heard this term, and I think it's time for us to just stop and think for a moment, like, what role do these knowledge workers play going forward if knowledge can be codified and regurgitated at will in Shakespearean style, or like a fast-talking southerner if you use ChatGPT or write a nursery rhyme about operating a machine. There has been a lot of technical developments. I want to switch a little bit of a focus to some of the technology behind it, and I want to bring in Ankit and ask Ankit a question. We are seeing these wild predictions about sizes of models. There's going to be a 1 trillion parameter model, there's going to be a 5 trillion, 10 trillion parameter model, and there is an inference that a larger model is better. And there has been a lot of conflict. People like keep talking about what would GPT-4 size be and so on, or it's already out there and nobody knows. But I just wanted to get from a technology perspective, how do you see these models that we are seeing today, the foundation models, evolve?
Yeah, so I think like the industry definitely figured out, or the research labs figured out, the scale is better, essentially. So when you scale these models from few billion parameters to hundreds of billions of parameters, obviously you see the performance go up. So there is no doubt that scale has helped the industry in some way. However, I think the problem that people are trying to realize is like, is it the right optimized model? Like the simple example is like unoptimized code versus optimized code. In this case, right, you can write a large piece of software, but it is not optimized enough. All right. So in this case, what people are realizing is like, can you get the similar performance? And I think there are some research papers out now which are also showing that you can get like similar performance to like 100 billion plus parameter model with just few billion parameters model. So the core tenet of this is like, how do you kind of have this either architectural innovations or data innovations or other innovations to kind of capture the value with minimal number of parameters? And I think there have been efforts on just quantization of those models and other things which have actually yielded similar performance or in the same line, essentially, if not exactly the same. So I think my take right now is that the industry is now definitely thinking about how to kind of minimize the number of parameters so that these models can be deployed in various applications where I think it could be in mobile or it could be in like some other applications where actually latency can become a huge thing, or also the training cost can also come down if you just reduce the number of parameters in the model.
Okay. Igor, I do want to ask you this question, but just for our audience, I want to ask Ankit a couple of terminology questions. We've all heard about things like foundation models, instruction-tuned models, RLHF. So, and you mentioned a term called quantization. So for maybe everybody's not familiar, can I rapid fire ask you these 3 questions so that you can just introduce these terms to the audience? I want everybody to walk out of this room with at least some basic grounding in what's a foundation model, what's RLHF, what's instruction tuning, and what's quantization.
So when people say foundation model, you can say it's like a big black box with like a lot of parameters similar to your brain, which has been fed like billions and billions of data points, essentially, and now it has like come up with like a memory of entire space or entire data that has been trained to, and now it can generate that text, essentially, or image, whatever. The instruction tuning part is saying that now let me take this foundation model and try to tune it for some tasks. For example, summarization. Right? Maybe you have just fed the data from all the books or all the articles or all the internet or a common crawl, which is like the popular database, essentially. And like now you are training these models, but now you want them to do something like summarization or like whatever else, like maybe dialogue or something like that, right? Just what ChatGPT does right now as a holding the conversation. So that is known as like a tuning of the foundation model, which is known as instruction tuning. And the original paper actually, I think so, it is from OpenAI on this one. And then there is something called as RLHF, which is reinforcement learning with human feedback. Essentially what it is trying to say is that now we have this model, this big black box you can think, Now we have added something so that it can summarize the data, or it can just hold a conversation through a dialogue. But now let me try to make it give some, let's say, persona. Very simple example, right? Now let me make ChatGPT more funny as compared to a base one, right? So in this case, like what I'll try to do is like try to understand how do I steer the model outputs towards a more funny conversation or more creative conversation rather than more fact-based conversation, for example. So people use this technique known as reinforcement learning with human feedback, where basically a lot of human label what is a more funnier conversation versus less funnier conversation, and then they try to tune the model towards that direction. So that is what is resulting in different class of models with different use cases that you see.
Fantastic, thank you. So let me ask Igor, our friend here. Let's talk a little bit about foundation models and what you are seeing, like as an organization that's already developing this. Do you buy into this foundation model for instruction tuning, fine-tuning scheme? Do you feel like domain-specific models perform better? What's your perspective?
Given that I launched this company at practically TiEcon 6 years ago, nobody's going to be able to tune a model that's funnier than you and I doing that discussion. So good luck with that. Look, when you think of things like this whole body topic that we're talking about, the regulatory environment has not caught up with what it can and can't do. Okay, so when people are talking about Copilot and things like that, let me clue you in on something that happened during our Amazon M&A. They give you a checklist, and they're like, what's open source, what's proprietary, and what's licensed code in this whole thing. What we didn't know after we essentially answered that checklist is they come in with something called Black Duck, and they end up scanning that entire code base and see if you were truthful, because they want to know what actual asset are they buying, and that's what ended up becoming the foundation of what you all terrorizes you in your homes, in your kitchens, and your bedrooms. So now we talk about Copilot, and I heard the tippy top of Microsoft that are creating these tools, and they're not even sure whether the code that's coming out of it is even anything that you can copyright or things of that sort. So while people are saying, hey, you can be super productive using these things, it may be as unattainable as an asset to increase the value of your companies, like me putting a sandwich for you at lunchtime on the moon.
Thank you. We are almost up to time. I want to ask A2, my dear friend, a very tough question, and end with that, and maybe if you have a few more minutes, we might take a few questions from the audience. So this is the toughest question on the list for you, Ashish, which is, who's making money with generative AI? I know Igor is already making money, so I'm not going to ask him this question, but who's making money with generative AI, and hopefully where?
Yeah, so it's still early, right? If you talk to any companies in this ecosystem, even if they've raised like hundreds of millions of dollars, on the customer journey, it's still early as enterprises are trying to figure out. That said, there are examples like Jasper and others, which were early to ride on this hype cycle. The way to look at it is like cloud happened about 10 years ago. Right. And it was initially like Amazon Web Services, there was like, hey, I have built this massive infrastructure, how can I monetize it? And then on top of it, a lot needed to happen. There's agile technologies that came along, there's DevOps tooling, there's orchestration, then monitoring, obviously regulatory and compliance tooling as well. All of that infrastructure is getting built right now. So for founders here, this is the massive opportunity. This is the big wave of the future. Yes, there are questions, and there were questions when cloud happened as well. Like, is it real? Should I move my data and infrastructure to something that is like a black box? I have no visibility or control into it. And those questions will be there whenever something this big happens. That's just human nature. But obviously, I'm an optimist. There's a lot going on. So right now, if you look at OpenAI, that's not the only vendor in town, right? With the foundation models. On top of it, how can you create things like agents, for example, by chaining these things together? And obviously, once you move to production, there will be other challenges. So a lot of opportunities is out there right now.
That's a great answer for all the founders or folks who are in this space. this is the time to get in, because I think this is the first version of what we are seeing. Very soon, we will see a lot more use cases in here. And if there's one thing you can take away from this panel, I would reiterate the optimism that Ashish talked about. This is a very fascinating, very promising technology. I would also caution that this is early days, but for entrepreneurs, you want to get in on the early days. You can make this much better, much more useful, and create a business. And hopefully, in 3 years from now, you would probably be doing a keynote at TiEcon in our AI/ML track. I'd love to have you folks here. So let's stop there. Thank you very much. You've been a great audience.
Yeah, amazing, amazing panel. We have time for one question. Okay, Dhaval Sir, go ahead.
Thank you, Tushar. A wonderful panel. Thank you for the wonderful knowledge. Question is, let's say, for example, a new hospital starts up, right? And they are collecting data, all sorts of data. At what point do you think they can start using this stuff? Means how much minimum data? Is there any guidelines on that? To collect before they can start implementing and using it for value, for predictions and stuff?
Right. So I'll actually turn this around a little bit. Often, like, this is not just restricted to generative AI. My experience with general machine learning has been that we feel that we don't have enough data, but there is often enough data that is similar to our data to use. That's sort of the concept of foundation models. So while this hospital might be new, the diseases in the humans and the doctors are not new. So there is a fair amount of information that you could still get and augment with the data that you are collecting. Now, for specific use cases, are you saying, so there was a research paper that said, and made a lot of headlines, that patients prefer ChatGPT to doctors. I think that's the detail below the headline is that ChatGPT is a lot more patient with patients, sorry, pardon the pun, and it is giving great explanations of diagnosis. Now, doctors are overworked in the US, like a lot of people know this. So if we are trying to solve that problem, which is a different problem than can ChatGPT diagnose a patient, but it has a better bedside manner than many doctors. And let the doctors do the diagnosis and let ChatGPT explain their symptoms to them, in which case you don't need that much data.
Thank you, Ashish, and the panelists. It was a pleasure.